I've always thought that a marriage seminar is sort of half-baked if you don't spend some time talking about the intimacy of marriage. It's not the only subject about marriage, but certainly it's a critical one. And I was getting ready, Cindy and I were getting ready in the hotel room to go. We were at what's called the Great Smoky Mountain Marriage Retreat one year, and I was scheduled to speak on sex. And I was kind of stressed about it. And I said, Cindy, can you think of anything more challenging than getting up in front of all these people and talking about sex? And she said, yes, being the wife of the man who which I hadn't thought of until she said it, and I thought, yeah, I'm sure that's right. I'm sure that she's right about that. I had a man come to me recently, a good friend of mine. He's a credentialed marriage and family counselor. And so he has a practice, and he has a couple of offices where he does his great work. And he came to me one day, I don't know, maybe a year ago. And he said, Glenn, have you ever considered that typically when preachers preach and they make reference to sex, that it's almost always negative? It's almost, and he emphasized that, and he hurt my feelings, of course, but it's almost always about sin. And almost never, and he wasn't chastising me, we're very close friends. It's almost never about sex in a good way. And I walked away and I thought, I think he's right about that. And you can understand why that's true. I mean, a couple of reasons. And one is that in our culture, sex is so distorted and we have so much trouble with it, and people need to be warned about sinful sex, about fornication. But the other thing that's true is that I think that we're very sensitive about it, and there should be discretion about sex. Over in Titus chapter 2, the older women are to teach the younger women to love their husbands, love their children, to be discreet and chaste, and keepers at home, and all that. But to be discreet and chaste, that means that biblically it's appropriate. Why do you think it's appropriate to be discreet about such matters? Don't you think it'd be all right for us just to chat about sex all the time? Let me tell you about my wife. Let me tell you about, you know what? I don't know about everybody. I don't know about women, for that matter, but I know about Christian men. It would be very rare for there to be a group of Christian men sitting around a breakfast table talking about their sexual relationship with their wife. That'd be I think that would be a very rare occurrence, and it's because of discretion. It's because, and don't you think that's wonderful? And it's wonderful because you have this most intimate relationship with just one person in the world. And it's not for talking about to other people, except, maybe when you have problems and you need some counseling of some kind, that's perfectly all right. But just as to share with everybody, that would be wrong. It's wrong for the same reason that wearing immodest clothing is wrong. Here's a woman who's got a husband, and her body belongs to him, and yet she wears that scanty clothing around to let other men admire her body, and she wears it for that reason. That's wrong. And what happens is we shoot ourselves in the foot. Let me tell you that God has saved His very best for us. In reference to the subject we're going to discuss tonight, intimacy in marriage, one of the obvious blessings of sex is the fact that it's so very personal, and that it's my wife and me, we're us, and everybody else is them. You know that? And this is something we don't share with other people. We don't. This is our own private world that we live in. And I would argue that that's one of the great blessings. God saved His very best for us. When you get to Romans chapter 1, and that's the chapter, it's not the only chapter, but it's one chapter that we use to talk about the sin of homosexuality. And there I go talking about sin again, but just so you can get the point. And he makes reference in there to a man and his wife. And he says that these men practicing homosexuality, watch this language. leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that, King James says, which is unseemly. Well, focus on that term, natural. And so he says the natural use of the woman. Who gets to say what is natural? And I would say that the Creator of all the world gets to do that. And when you get to 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 2, to avoid fornication, I mean, marriage is a sexual relationship. It's supposed to be. Nothing shameful about that. God made Eve from Adam's rib, and he presented her, Genesis chapter 2. And the last verse of Genesis chapter 2 says, and they were both naked, the man and the wife, the woman, and they were not ashamed. Now, why do you reckon he put that last clause on that verse? And they were not ashamed. Well, because he's setting the pace for marriage. Marriage is a sexual relationship. So to avoid fornication, and fornication is kind of an umbrella word that means sinful sex. To avoid sinful sex, let every man have his own wife, every woman have her own husband. 1 Corinthians 7:9 says it's better to marry than to burn. Marriage implies sex. Now, answer this question. What's the primary purpose of sex in marriage? The answer is, I mean, if you respond, procreation. I understand. I believe I'm old enough to understand the role that sex plays in procreation. I got that. But that's not the answer. If the question is, what is the primary purpose of intimacy in marriage? It's not procreation. That's secondary. This is rather beautiful, I think. Primary purpose is to draw husbands and wives closer together. They're going to be a sexual couple, married couple, long after the childbearing years are over. It's not primarily about that. That's a blessing of sex in marriage, but it's not the primary purpose. Primary purpose is to draw husbands and wives closer together. And you take a man, we'll talk about this some more in a bit, but a normal man cannot be apart from his wife for long periods of time before the volume, if you please, gets louder and louder in his ears, and he needs to get back to his wife. So here's how I want to present this tonight. There are 5 things about intimacy in marriage that you cannot change. And then there are 5 other things that you can change. So that's going to be the course of this session. Here's the first one. You can't change the fact that all marriages have a frequency imbalance. So it's not so terribly uncommon in discussions about marriage that somebody will ask, particularly the wife, I think, what is the biblical, does the Bible give you any kind of biblical guidance about the frequency of intimacy? And it's because we're different. We're different about that. And we'll talk about that some more in a minute too. But here's the answer. The biblical, it does have something to say about the frequency of intimacy in marriage. And it's in 1 Corinthians 7, beginning in verse 2. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife. Let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to he's talking about sex. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her. You know what? It's because intimacy is part of marriage, and that's why God created it. You know, Matthew chapter 19 and verse 4, and Jesus said, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this cause you'll put away your husband, your father, mother, and cleave to your husband. And so in other words, I made you 2 genders in order that you would get married. My grandmother married, I think, when she was 14, and she said that Papa, their bodies rest in the Elkins Cemetery in Cannon County, Tennessee. But she said that Papa married her because she wouldn't let him kiss her till they were married. You render to your wife the affection due her, likewise husband, wife, wife, husband. And then he says this, the wife does not have authority over her own body. And listen, ladies, that does not, gentlemen, that does not give license to abuse. It doesn't change the fact that the Bible says in Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wives like Christ loved the church. And then it says, and gave himself for her. You've got to be willing to die for your wife. And 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7 says, I want you to honor your wives as the weaker vessel and as being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. It doesn't change that fact. And yet, it does say that the wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And then he flips it over. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And what is the biblical frequency of marriage? And the answer is that marriage is for the sexual satisfaction of both, despite the fact that sometimes you're going to have a frequency imbalance. Why didn't God make us equal in the desire for intimacy, in the frequency of intimacy? I don't know. I don't know that. I don't know the reason. I expect it's because of what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11:9. Nor was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. I expect it has something to do with this point. Man has a biological need. That's going to be our next point, but that a woman doesn't have. I read one study that said that in 85% of marriages, man's need for frequency of intimacy is greater than his wife's. So there's 15%. I don't know how they decided, how scientific that is. I don't know. I know that I asked Mrs. Colley one day, why do you think, and I was sincere in the question, why do you think that God did it this way, where the man's need for intimacy and frequency is greater than his wife? And don't you think there's been an awful lot of young brides who have turned to their husbands and said, you mean you want it again? Didn't we just do that? Because she's just learned that his need for frequency is greater than hers. Cindy, why do you think that God did it that way? And she didn't, I married her for her wit. Maybe not only for that reason. But she didn't miss a beat. She said, who would take care of the children? Which I thought that was pretty good. Okay, now, along the same lines, things you cannot change. Sex is not optional in his mind. It's not an optional thing. And the longer he's away from a typical husband, the longer he's away from his wife, the more challenging it becomes. His being drawn to other women, females who walk by him, becomes more challenging the longer he's away from his wife. Now, that does not mean that if he lusts for another woman, that somehow his wife is to be blamed for that. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying, he would be guilty of that sin. What I'm saying, though, just so that you know, is that it would become increasingly challenging for him the longer he's away from his wife. Now, that's going to change. Sometimes it changes because of health issues. Sometimes it will gradually change as a result of age and so forth, but you get the point. Now, the Bible recognizes this. So Jacob has a couple of wives and a couple of concubines, and polygamy never has worked out very well, because we're only cut out for one. We're only made for one, and you can establish that biblically. But one of Leah's sons comes in from the field, and he's found some mandrakes. Now, mandrake was a root. You can Google mandrake, and anyway, it was believed to encourage procreation and enhance fertility. I do not know how they used the mandrakes, if they boiled them into a tea or put them under the mattress. I don't know what they did with the mandrakes, but they believed that it would promote fertility. And so this son of Leah comes in and says, I found some mandrakes. Well, Leah her womb was prolific. She could have babies. And Rachel couldn't. And she was desperate, as you recall. Give me children or else I die. I have to have children. And they have this, Rachel and her sister Leah have this discussion about the mandrakes. And Rachel is negotiating with Leah to get them because she believes it might help her become pregnant. And what's interesting about that discussion between the two sisters is that they're negotiating on who gets to spend the night with him that night. A given in the discussion is that whoever spends the night with him is going to have sex with him, which is interesting. That wasn't part of the discussion. That was a given. A man is biologically driven. In every case where sexual sin is actually committed in the Bible, the man is the aggressor. David and Bathsheba, Joshua and Tamar, Amnon and Tamar. Think about the book of Proverbs. You have a baker's dozen, 13 or maybe even 14 occasions where you have strong warnings against sinning in connection to sex. All of them are warnings to men to control their desires and avoid ungodly women and prostitutes. When you get to the New Testament and you read verses, passages about wearing modest clothing, have you ever considered the fact that I think you can extrapolate this and talk about how that men ought to dress appropriately too. And I believe that. But the warnings in the Bible are all gender specific. Whoever looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery. Why doesn't it say it the other way around? Wouldn't that be true, that a woman shouldn't lust after a man? Yes, but that's not what it says. And why not? And it's because the Bible is acknowledging the reality of the biological need of the man. And so 1 Timothy chapter 2, where you have the phrase modest apparel, it's about what a woman wears. Titus 2:4 that I mentioned a while ago, a woman is to be discreet and chaste. A man is biologically driven, and for a man, the act of intimacy in marriage is not merely about a physical, biological release. It's something else. He uses, that's a hard word, he knows that is the way that he reconnects with his wife. And this is more than physical. And if you've been married very long, I mean, if you're a husband, if you're a man, all of you understand it. If you're a woman, you may not really grasp this, but it's true. And he may have had a terrible day. You know, that toilet upstairs has overflowed again, and the stairs have to be cleaned now. And the transmission in that old van is going out. And where are we going to get the $4,000 to put a and my boss, I've been trying to find the time when I could tell him I've got to have a raise, but I just can't seem to get the courage up because I'm afraid he might fire me. And it just goes on and on. But his wife is very receptive to him, and maybe she even initiates intimacy that night. And they have a wonderful private time together. And they're laying there in the bed. And he says, you know what? I'm going to ask my boss for that raise tomorrow. And hey, I think I know where I could get a good deal on transmission. And suddenly the ship is righted. It's not so uncommon for a husband and wife to kind of be at odds with one another, and apologies are made. But until he's intimate with her, he may not feel just right. What happens is that the intimacy has a way psychologically of righting the ship. Now you can think about that, and ladies, you certainly can ask your husband about if they agree with that, if that's the truth or not. I would encourage you to have that discussion. These are some things that you cannot do anything about, and one is that he's biologically driven, and it's different from a wife. Does a wife enjoy intimacy with her husband? Hopefully so. The Bible, in the King James, in 1 Corinthians 7, uses the word defraud. Don't defraud one the other. You know what defraud means? When I was a young preacher preaching in Virginia, we had some people break into the church building at night. I don't know what they were. Maybe they were druggies. I don't know. But what did they think they were going to get in a church? Maybe they thought we had contributions laying around, or maybe recording equipment. I don't know. But anyway, they were caught. And I was called in to court. The prosecutor wanted me to come in to testify that I, as the minister, I had the prerogative of permitting people in the building at night. And Mr. Colley, did you give these people permission to come in at night? So that was my whole deal. It wasn't, all that much. I practiced my lines. But I went to court a little bit early, and I listened to a couple of cases. This is in Roanoke, Virginia. And the judge had before him somebody who had been shoplifting in Roanoke and had been caught a couple of times at it. And the judge just threw the book at him and said, "You're from Blacksburg." And he shook his finger at him and he said, "Why don't you just go to Blacksburg and defraud those merchants up there?" And I'm a Bible student, and when you're a Bible student, words just trigger thoughts. And that word defraud took me to 1 Corinthians 7. I was probably the only one in the room thinking about sex. But because the Bible says in 1 Corinthians 7 about the intimacy of marriage, ready for this? Your body belongs to him and your body belongs to her. And then it says, don't defraud one the other, except it be with consent for a season, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer. And then you come together again, that Satan tempt you not for your lack of self-control. That is to say that you don't want to mess around with this. You stay apart for long periods of time sexually, and what's going to happen is that the devil's going to get the memo, and he will put temptation in your path. Number next. Sin poisons great sex. These are things you cannot change. So back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. What kinds of things poison great sex? Pornography will do that. Whoever looks on a woman to lust after her. Your wife has the ability to see. She has eyes in the back of her head. You think your wife doesn't pay attention when you all are in a restaurant and it's hot weather outside and those young women, they walk by your table in those little skinny things, those revealing things. You think that your wife doesn't pay attention to what your eyes do? Or if you're in the mall, and does Victoria's Secret still exist? Okay. You walk down, Cindy and I haven't done this in a while, but you walk down the mall, down the corridor there, and you think that, you're walking down with your wife and you lag a little bit and you do this? Victoria's Secret. You think your wife doesn't pay attention to that? Pornography will poison great sex. It's not fair to a wife to have to lay with her husband thinking, I wonder if he's thinking about those images right now. And I must compete. I cannot compete with those women. I cannot do that. And that's, gentlemen, not fair. Self-gratification poisons great sex. And sometimes people ask me in Q&A, this is not something that you can talk about much, but this is a marriage seminar. What about this? What about masturbation? What about that subject? And does the Bible condemn that? And the answer is, for unmarried people, it doesn't have an explicit condemnation. It doesn't have to. Sometimes the Bible condemns things implicitly. And in this case, you have the issues of creating mental images and habits. And I'll tell you right now, we've got an inordinate amount of young men who have been looking at pornography so long, and this being part of that, this subject that I'm mentioning now, being part of that when they marry, they cannot function normally. Does that shock you? They cannot function normally anymore. Now, by and by, they will be able to, but they've got to get over this first. What poisons great sex? Obviously, adultery does. Galatians 5:19 says you can't go to heaven as an adulterer. So just let me plant this seed in the list of the 5 things that you can't do anything about. This is going to be factual. You have to guard your sexuality and make sure that you're for your wife only in every way, and you only have eyes for her, and you only have eyes for him. Here's number 4. A typical husband never gets tired of seeing his wife unclothed. Now, I want you to know something about your husband. He doesn't understand this. I mean, he understands that that's true, that that's a true statement. And when you get older and you've been married for decade after decade after decade, and he has seen you this way thousands and thousands of times, it don't matter. He's still going to have the same joy that he has now at seeing you. Now that he doesn't understand. He knows it's a fact, but he doesn't understand it. And it's like that God took, when he made the woman, and he looked at this part or that part or that part, and he put electricity in them, in the mind of a man. I mean, what's the difference between a woman's breast and a woman's elbow? And you go ahead and try to logic that out. And I would say that there is only one difference, and that is God and what he did inside of the man, in the psyche of the man. I don't think men understand why. They just know that it's true. Now, it's a temptation for a wife. You're never going to be able to change this. And by the way, God did this remarkable thing when he made husbands and wives grow older at basically the same rate of speed. Grow older at the same rate of speed. And that as your body changes and evolves and all of that, you're married to somebody who's experiencing essentially the same thing Don't you think that's wonderful? Because you don't have to make excuses. Y'all are pretty much the same. Pretty much. And ladies, I think that it may be the case that you find this just too strange, that he always is wanting to see you. And you maybe you'll want to resist that. And so you find clever ways at night to change into your night clothes, whatever you wear, so that he doesn't see any of those parts, really, while you're changing into your night things. Maybe you could be very creative about that. Or when you come out of the shower, you come out of the bathroom, that you be very careful. Or when you're, I don't know, doing housework or whatever it happens to be. Is that my phone? I don't think so. Or whatever it happens to be, that you try to be very discreet around him so that he doesn't see those parts of you. I'm about to do the husbands a great favor. They will probably pay me tonight. Stop that. Stop it. You know, I'm saying that tongue in cheek. I love you all. What you expect of him is that he will have eyes only for you. You do not want him looking at other women. And when you have those occasions where that little flirty heifer walks by dressed that way that I described, and you look at his eyes and he's not watching her. Maybe he saw her and he diverted his eyes, because that's what Christian men do. They divert their eyes. When that registers in their mind, they shift their eyes to something else. And when you know that your husband does that, you know he's trying to be a faithful Christian in reference to this subject, why shouldn't he get to look at you? And maybe what you think is, oh yeah, but one young bride said to Cindy, she didn't say this to me, of course, but she said to Cindy, they hadn't been married very long, and she said, Cindy, you know, I like to exercise every morning, but I learned I don't need to exercise in front of him, because if I do, it's going to take longer. And maybe that's what wives are thinking. I don't want him to look at me because it may result in things taking longer. But the fact is that if he is, if you please, well-fed, it won't typically be like that. He will enjoy getting to see the most beautiful creature he's ever seen, and that's how he feels about it. That's how he feels about it. I do not know about, I know that we're not living in the miraculous age, but in reference to this subject, I can tell you this. There's something that's a first cousin to miraculous, and it's the way your husband feels when he looks at you. It is what is real. Okay, you can't change that fact. A typical husband is never going to get tired of seeing his wife. Here's number 5. You can't change that all wives have a SARG. That's a manufactured word, and it means sex affection ratio gauge. Did your wife ever say to you, you only love me for one thing? You know, maybe she's just a little irritated. I think you only love me for one thing. And most husbands will respond, yeah. You know, well, of course. And then she'll whack him. Just teasing. But most wives are sensitive, knowing after they've been married for not very long how important intimacy is to him, that she would start measuring in her mind the affection, what she would define as affection, versus the actual sexual relationship. For many years in seminars, I've done a test. I'm not going to do it in this one, but I have done this test where I ask the women, before they know what I'm going to talk about, I say, write on a piece of paper, the last 2 weeks, the most romantic thing that your husband has done for you. No names. I don't want to know who wrote them, but the most romantic thing your husband's done for you the last couple of weeks, and turn them in. And so they'll get a stack. And let me tell you what happens. And I love to do this experiment because it always turns out the same. Now, I don't ask the husbands to do it because I think it would be mono-themed. But it's not for women. It is, listen closely, it's very rare that any of the men any of the women will write anything sexual. They don't write sexual things. Most romantic thing my husband did for me the last couple of weeks, it'll be like this. He picked up the dishes and loaded them into the dishwasher without me asking him. He vacuumed the living room floor. Sometimes, the closest it gets to romantic, what we would think about that way, he brought me flowers at work. Or he let me sleep in late and he took care of the kids. Those are the kinds of things they think about, and they're thinking about and I'm talking, when she talks about that vacuum cleaner and that dishwasher, she's thinking that's a romantic act. All wives, gentlemen, carry a fairly accurate sex affection ratio gauge. What I'm teaching is that you need to be nice to her every day, not just when you want sex. Affirm her. Communicate to her in ways that she understands. Be a student of your wife. Hold her hand. If you're taking a walk and you go by a big oak tree, don't waste it. Go take her behind the tree and kiss her good. Get her flowers. Now, I do not, my wife loves flowers. And so occasionally, I'll go to the store and I'll buy her a fistful of flowers. You ought to put the flowers in your speed dial and do that often. And I always play the game. I put them behind my back and come in the house, and then we do this thing where she says, "What's behind your back?" "Oh, nothing. Why are you asking?" We'll have this little back and forth thing, and I give her the flowers. I don't understand flowers. I think the flowers are pretty. If Cindy ever gives me any flowers for the rest of my life, it's okay with me. They're pretty and they smell like a funeral and all that, but I don't need them. That's okay. But she loves them, and something in her eyes. There's something in her eyes when I give her a fistful of flowers. You ought to get her flowers. All right, here we go. Things that you can change. You can change who initiates. Your husband, if you really want to hurt your husband, and a wife can really do that, what if you treat him like he's an addict? You want it again? Again? What if you treat him like that? What if he hesitates to initiate intimacy with you because your reaction is always negative? What happens then? You want to really kick his ego? Flip it over. Wait a minute. What if instead of that sometimes you initiate? I don't mean every time, but what about once in a while you initiate intimacy with your husband? What if you're going over to some Christian's house for supper and you go to the door and just as he's ringing the bell, you lean up to his ear and you say, "When I get you home," bing bong. And it won't be very long into that evening that he's going to say, "Time really passes by. I'll tell you, we've had a lovely evening. We're going to need to go." What is that? What if you initiate? What if sometimes, I'm not saying every time, what if you send him a message? Be careful to make sure that it's extremely private. But what if you send him a little message to work and says, "What I'm thinking about for tonight, when you and your husband get home in the evening, listen to this old preacher. Don't you kiss your husband like you kiss your grandmother." You can change who initiates intimacy. Remember, the longer he's without sex, the more difficult it is for him. You have a husband. What does your husband do when supper's late? What does he do? You don't have to raise your hand, because I already know what he does. He does what I do. Supper's late, and he'll walk over to the refrigerator, and he'll open it up, and he'll just stand there. Maybe open a drawer. He's hungry. He's just looking for something. The longer he's away from you, the more that's how it feels. Now, I've heard wives ask this question, but what about the times that I'm not really into it, but I'm doing it because I love my husband, and I know he needs it tonight? There's a term for that people use, and it's maintenance sex. And there's nothing wrong with quick sex, maintenance sex, provided it's all you have. And sometimes that is going to be all that there is because of schedule and exhaustion. And you know what? He's going to really appreciate that you're aware. It's a funny thing about women. I think women really want the freedom to speak about issues with their bodies, issues they have with their bodies, and they speak openly of this to their husbands who don't really understand all of those things. They just accept them But if a husband wants to explain difficulties he has with his, don't do that. Don't do that. Well, I don't know. I think those are personal matters. I understand that. But all I'm saying is that you can change who initiates sex. And I'm telling you, you have a great opportunity. If he feels like that he's failing, if he feels like you just have to put up with him, he's not going to be the man that you really want him to be. You have so much that you can show him. And if he thinks that he is pleasing to you in reference to this part of your marriage, it's going to have a positive effect on his whole psyche. He connects. I'm telling you that your husband connects sex with the respect that you have for him. Why do you think in Proverbs chapter 5, when it talks about loose women, that he uses this terminology? Proverbs writer says that men are drawn by the flattery of their eyelids. What does that mean? It means that she shows him something he really needs, and that is respect. You can change, here's the next one, the routine of utter predictability. So, I don't know, husbands and wives may be different about this, and maybe what she's about is just whatever works well, so it becomes very predictable, and something you can change. And it may be that you'll maybe get a book to read together on this subject. Now, I don't think you should both go into Books A Million, because a lot of that stuff is pornographic, and so it'd be good for the wife just to go in there and find something that's tastefully done, and then you can enjoy going through that together. The predictability. And sometimes it's the case that a wife just wants to, just whatever works. Let's just do that and we stick with that. And maybe the husband wants to be more adventurous, and maybe y'all are out in the woods and you're taking a hike one day and he looks at you with those eyes, and why don't we walk over there? And no, we couldn't do that. Well, maybe you could. And I don't want you to do anything dangerous, but I could tell you this. When he's on his deathbed and he's drawing his last few breaths, he will use one of them to say, "Remember the hike?" Number 3, the 5 things you can do something about. You can change how well you communicate to your wife that she's all that you need. Sir, your standard of beauty is your spouse. God did not make Eve and say, "Does she suit you, Adam?" And he didn't give Adam a menu, and it had all the different hair colors, shapes, or sizes, or height. None of that. God made Eve for him. Gentlemen, your wife has everything that you need, and you must communicate to her that very thing. Adam said, "This is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh." She'll be called woman because she was taken out of a man. I repeat, pornography damages a wife, and she pays attention to how you look at other women. You can change number 4, how you occasionally say no. I don't know how much you paid to come to the seminar. It's probably worth it for this one thing. Is it a sin for a wife to say no to her husband? And, after all, we went in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and the word defraud, and I talked about all that means. Is it a sin for a wife to say no? Well, certainly there's a level on which the answer has to be yes to that, and yet a prudent wife knows how to say no. Because aren't there going to be times when it's just inopportune? Maybe you just don't feel well. Maybe cycles, or maybe your head really does hurt and you just don't think you could do it. Or maybe you took your bath and you got dressed and you fixed your hair and you're putting on the last finishes of whatever they call that makeup you use in that mirror, and it's his off day, and you turn and look and you see his eyes and you think, "Oh, me." How do you say no? Can you say no and not do wrong? Can you say no and not bruise his ego to where he's just hurt? And the answer is yes. And here's how you do it. You look at him and you say, "Honey, listen, I know what you're thinking, and I really want to be with you too. But now is not a good time for me. But if you will wait till tonight at 10:30, I'll make it worth your while. You know how he's going to respond? That's how he's going to respond. You haven't hurt him. You haven't bruised him. He's not going to walk away crying. It's all good. But now I must warn you, you don't need to wait till 10:31 because he's going to be watching the clock. He will watch the clock. All right, here's the last one. You can change how you prepare for sex. I'm not talking about maintenance sex that we described a while ago or spur of the moment, spontaneous something. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the normal kind. And I think a wife could easily, and maybe a husband too, I don't know, can reason that he or she doesn't care about my hygiene and all of that. I don't, in counseling, I have some rules, the women rules. I was raised with the women rules, and all preachers, not just preachers, all husbands ought to have women rules that they abide by. So I don't counsel a woman alone in my office with the door closed. I just never do it. I won't do it. I was with a woman the other day. She came in to talk about some problems. And I sat at my desk, and she sat across in the chair, and she said, I'm just going to close this. And she closed the door. And listen, I came right, I may have overreacted. I just came right up out of the chair, and I said, tell you what, let's just leave this open, because I'm not going to do that. I don't meet with a woman alone at the church building. I'm not going to do it. I don't. So if a woman comes to talk, we're going to do it with the door open of my office, and the secretary is just there, right up the hall there, right there. And another thing is that I don't talk about detailed sexual problems with women. I'm just not going to do it. And so occasionally in marriage counseling, the woman will say, well, you know, here's a problem in bed that we're having. And I tell you what, wait just a minute. I think it would be better if you would have this conversation with Mrs. Colley, and she'll be so happy to have that discussion with you. I've never had a woman to fuss about that. They always understand it, and so I don't do that. I was speaking at a deal one time, and it was being held at a civic center with a lot of different classes going on simultaneously, and mine happened to be about marriage and issues of marriage. And so went out to the corridor, lots of people out there, and there was a bench, and this woman said, can I talk to you? Of course. And so we sat down. So I didn't say to her, you need to talk to Cindy about this. But we weren't far from that. You know, anyway, she said, I've got a real problem. It's about my husband and about the bedroom, and I'm sorry. And then she blurted out, she said, he doesn't shower, and he doesn't brush his teeth, and his teeth are rotting. How would you respond to that? I didn't know what to say. If he had been there, I would have known what to say. I would have said it to him and not to her. But what advice would you give that poor, wretched woman? What would you say to that? Well, that's an extreme case, of course. And none of you are there. All I'm saying is, let's just, gentlemen, let's just make a rule or two, can we? Take a shower. Use soap. Brush your teeth. Some of you old ugly men are wearing facial hair. Uh-oh, maybe the majority. Okay, here's the rule about facial hair. I just made this up. You don't have to abide by my rules. But I think a man ought to say to his wife, do you prefer me with or without facial hair? And whatever the woman says, be smart and do it. Cologne. You think you should wear cologne when you're with her? Well, I think you should ask her. Do you like me with cologne or without cologne? And whatever the woman says, why wouldn't you do it? Do what she says, what she prefers. And let's be considerate of each other without being asked. Let's just be considerate of each other. Here's the sexual goal for marriage in this one in our session. It's Proverbs chapter 5, and he's warning about a loose woman. And don't you be going close to her. Don't go near the door of her house. Drink water from your own cistern and running water from your own well. Should your fountains be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be only your own and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice with the wife of your youth. As a loving deer and a graceful doe, Let her breast satisfy you at all times and be always enraptured with her love. There you go. I'm so glad you came. Tomorrow, we will meet back at, do we start at 7 o'clock tomorrow night? Yes. 7 o'clock. And the last session will be anybody who wants to come, but it's particularly going to be directed at people who are not yet married. And we'll talk about putting that golden band on the right, left hand. I pray that God will bless you. If you can just find one or two things from the whole seminar that you feel like you can do better, I challenge you to do it, and I challenge you to say it to your spouse. You know, I picked up a couple of things. Or if it's just one, I tell you what I thought about tonight. I can do better about that, and I'm committed to do it. Just say it to your spouse. Give that man or that woman that gift. I'm going to do that, and then do it. Would you pray with me, please? We praise you, Father, for marriage, because in your creative genius, you made two genders, and you didn't have to do it. And procreation could have come from simply one asexual creature, but you made two, and you did it with marriage in mind. And we thank you for that. And we know that in the Bible you protect this thing called marriage, and help us to learn from that so that we too work very hard to protect this thing that you call marriage. Bless our marriages. Help us not only to find the right person to marry, help us to be the right person. And we ask you for forgiveness. In Jesus' name, amen. Good night. God bless you.